All right, potential problems with interest groups, you say? All right, so we're going to talk about 4 of them in this video. Inequality of political economic resources, unequal access to decision makers, hyperpluralism, and a free rider problem. All right, so the fact of the matter is that some groups have larger membership or are very well funded, and this increases the influence that they have. So the AARP has millions of members. The NRA has several million members, so it has a large membership, but it is also extremely well funded. And so these are interest groups that tend to have a disproportionate amount of influence relative to other interest groups. And right along with that is the fact that as a result of some groups being more well funded than others and having larger memberships, well, they typically have more access to policymakers, which enables them to have a greater influence on public policy. So we think back to iron triangles and we think about what the interest groups want and get. They are able to trade their campaign contributions, the votes that they have of their members, in exchange for that access to legislators, policies that are made that are favorable to their interest group. So when we think about that, this really suggests that maybe rather than promoting pluralist democracy like we mentioned earlier and like James Madison would have hoped, maybe interest groups can actually end up contributing towards elite democracy, where the largest and most well-funded groups are the ones who really have all the power, rather than this nice balance. Along with that, another critique of Madison's pluralist democracy is that maybe it isn't pluralism, maybe it has turned into hyper-pluralism. This is the idea that so many groups want conflicting policies that the only result is policy gridlock. So if you take something like abortion as an issue, pro-choice, pro-life, there isn't much room for compromise. And there are a number of groups on either side, and so you're not going to have compromise policies between the two sides, so we end up with no policy getting made. And so there's the idea that maybe having so many groups doesn't actually lead to good outcomes because it promotes compromise, but maybe it just ends up with gridlock and an inability to get anything done. Legislation often benefits the membership of interest groups over the general public. So something like corn subsidies or ethanol subsidies, it's a very, very small number of people or corporations that benefit directly from those subsidies, but everybody else pays for it. And we're actually going to talk about that term later on in the unit. There's something called client politics, which is exactly that idea, where a very small group of people benefit, but everybody pays for it. Again, think about what the purpose is of an interest group. It is to make sure to benefit their membership, not necessarily the general public. Some interest groups face what is known as a free rider problem. This is when people benefit from a group's efforts without joining. And if they don't join, that means they don't pay any dues. So groups that seek a collective benefit for a large group of people, they are susceptible to this free rider problem. So they do the work, and they, for AARP, they work to make sure Social Security or Medicare or whatever program it is that they're supporting, and everybody who qualifies will benefit from their efforts, even if they're not a member. So this is a problem for them. You see how the AARP has tried to solve that problem by offering gifts with membership. Another problem is that of the revolving door. And this is that about half of all congressmen, believe it or not, after they leave their job in Congress, they become lobbyists. So they go and they work for the interest group that had been lobbying Congress before. Why is this a problem? Because, they're free to do what they want after they leave Congress. Well, it leaves us with this question, which we might find troubling. Are the congressmen making policy while still in office, when they are still in Congress, to benefit a particular interest group to assure themselves a high-paying job later? That would be very troubling, because that means that they would be doing the work of the interest group instead of the public so that they can get themselves a nice high-paying job after they leave Congress. So to try to limit that sort of thing, we have had some efforts to regulate congressional lobbyists, so they must register with the government. That means that we get to know publicly the name of all lobbyists, so we can find out if former congressmen do this. They must report their earnings, again publicly, so we know exactly who's paying them and how much they're getting paid. They are not allowed to give gifts to members of Congress, and they have tried to limit the revolving door by instituting a waiting period of about 2 years. Depends on if you're in the House or the Senate. So there's this cooling off period, so you can't go immediately from your job in Congress to become a lobbyist. So what gives interest groups the freedom to operate? Well, they are protected by the First Amendment's free speech clause. And so they exercise that free speech to influence policy in a way that benefits their membership. Whether this is good or bad for democracy is clearly subject to debate, and I want us to be able to kind of have both perspectives on that, so we could write on either side of how interest groups further democracy, as well as we could take the other position of how they actually limit or impede democracy. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button. This has been a La Money production.